Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, the group chat that's rocked Washington, D.C.
We begin tonight with a question. How on earth did this happen?
We'll talk about the senior U.S. officials discussing bombing Yemen on Signal, the journalist added to their chat, and the fallout. I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take.
My name is Ken Klippenstein. I'm an independent reporter. I run a newsletter called kenklippenstein.com. I focus on national security a lot. So as you can imagine, what's transpired this past week has been of great interest to me.
Absolutely. So Ken, for today's topic, a group chat on the commercial app Signal discussing the U.S. bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. So I'm going to just run through some of the names that are apparently on this chat. I'm talking to you on Wednesday morning as of right now. All of them still have their jobs. U.S. Vice President JD Vance, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, Editor-in-Chief of The Atlantic Magazine Jeffrey Goldberg. So obviously one of these things is not like the other. Goldberg, a journalist who was seemingly added by mistake, days later publishes what is to be his first piece called "The Trump Administration Accidentally Texted Me Its War Plans." Now, we'll go through this step by step. First, just tell me what was in that first article.
Yeah, so our sense of what the contents was depends on what The Atlantic chose to publish, which wasn't everything and is something that they've received some criticism for. But what he described, and to some extent included, was discussion of the airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen that took place last week. And unfortunately, that's gotten short shrift amid all the discussion about operational security and whether it was advisable that they were talking about these things on Signal. But really what they were talking about was that set of airstrikes, which itself is significant because for the first time, unlike the Biden administration, they targeted Houthi leadership elements as well as what's called command and control facilities. That is to say, how you run their governance structure. So that was a really significant escalation. And that's something that I think we should debate and consider and really is the hallmark foreign policy decision, at least in the CENTCOM area, the Middle East, of the Trump administration so far.
So the crux of the initial scandal is that it happened before the strikes happened. So why did that rise to the level of a scandal in the Trump White House, which it takes a lot to be a scandal?
Yeah, so as you just said, I mean, this includes the most powerful people in the Trump administration, all in the same place. I mean, you have to imagine that this would be like the grand slam in terms of targets for Foreign Intelligence Service to be able to peer in on. We know of things as specific as targeting sets, down to the individual officials that they're targeting of Houthis, and which they did target and take out. So the concern is that, by discussing these things before they're happening, I should say proximate to their happening. It sounds like they were talking about this stuff right before it happened, that this could give some sense to somebody, some interloper peering in on their conversation about what is going to happen, and that could endanger those operations and U.S. assets in the region.
Let's talk about the fallout. Trump's people attempted to downplay the significance of this in the Senate Intelligence Committee. 3 high-ranking officials who were on the chat, including the CIA director, just get absolutely grilled under oath.
Is your testimony that it was appropriate that he was added to this signal thread?
No, of course not. And
why did you not call?
Hold on, Senator. You're mischaracterizing my testimony.
Good. You answered the question. Let me ask you. When he was added to the thread, you're the CIA director. Why didn't you call out that he was present on the signal thread?
They tried to circle the wagons, but it doesn't really work out. That hearing, did you watch that hearing? What was notable about that hearing?
Yes, I watched the whole thing. What stood out to me was the difference in responses. Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, wouldn't even cop to the fact that she was in the chat.
Question, ma'am. You were not TG on this group chat?
I'm not going to get into the specifics.
So you refuse to acknowledge whether you were on this group chat?
Senator, I'm not going to get into the specifics.
Why are you going to get into the specifics? Is it because it's all classified?
Because this is currently under review.
And to his credit, the Central Intelligence Agency director, he did admit that, and he came clean. He said, yes, I was in the chat. Yes, that was me. And, kind of in the background of all this is the fact that the Trump National Security Council had already admitted that the chat was authentic and it wasn't some piece of disinformation or something that Jeffrey Goldberg, the Atlantic editor, had been fed. And what stood out to me most was that they both testified, both of those officials, under oath, that none of what was discussed was classified.
Right. Yeah, so that becomes the thing that they're hanging their hat on. Well, it's maybe improper, but it wasn't classified. I'm keen to get your take on the journalism side of all of this. There are a lot of questions about Goldberg's role in this story, and he's spoken about the decision not to initially publish everything. This was an interview that he had with CNN.
I didn't publish this, and I continue not to publish it because it felt like it was too confidential, too technical, and I worry, honestly, that sharing that kind of information in public could endanger American military personnel.
As of Wednesday, he has ended up publishing the full details of the chat in response to repeated denials from the Trump administration that no classified information or war plans were shared.
There was no classified information, as I understand it.
Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that.
There was no classified material that was shared in that.
So then, if there was no classified material, share it with the committee.
What did we learn from this second article that he published, which is called, by the way, the title, "Here Are the Attack Plans That Trump's Advisors Shared on Signal"?
It gets into the granularity of their discussion. I mean, you have the National Security Advisor talking about one target in particular, somebody I think who worked on the Houthi drone program. He talks about him walking into a building where his girlfriend is staying, and then he says, we took him out, and they're sharing of, American flag emojis and fists and things. And I think the intention on the part of Goldberg here is to show, okay, here's the specificity and granularity with which they're talking about these things. Because in the testimony by the top intelligence officials in the Trump administration to the Senate yesterday, they tried to stress that, this was all very general and, we're not really getting into anything secret enough. And I think it's a complicated issue because, to be honest, in many respects, you could say that it was general, even in the case of the specific targeting, just because it was so proximate to when it happened and they're talking about it after it took place. And in addition to all of that, I should say that during the chat, they did talk about going high side. That's kind of in NatSec world speak for going to those secure classified systems to see more specifics. So there was some effort to segregate the super secure information from the chat. And that's not to say that the chat was advisable. I mean, completely aside from secrecy, there's something called the Presidential Records Act, which ensures that these kind of discussions enter the historical record so that we, the people, can understand what our government was doing, when it's declassified or when it's put in the presidential library or the National Archives. And when you do something like this and conduct a discussion like this on a chat app that is, famous for having disappearing messages, it might not enter into the historical record. And I personally think more pressing one than the question of classification, because when you get into classification, there is so much authority and latitude granted to the executive branch, not just the president, but what is called original classification authorities, OCAs, which are designated by the president. That's, for example, the Secretary of Defense, Director of National Intelligence, Central Intelligence Agency Director, all the people that all the people we're talking about now. They have a huge latitude to decide not just what is classified, but what is declassified. So I think the Democrats, if they pursue that particular avenue, are going to bump up against some really difficult legal realities about how much power the executive branch has. Question of public records.
But it isn't in a way, is classification a red herring? I mean, from an intelligence gathering perspective, do adversaries care if this is classified or not, if the detail is this granular?
No, you're right. And I think that the debate around this should focus on, what is the common sense implication of having these kinds of discussions? And I think that's another difficult conversation to have, because if you look at it, there is some discussion beforehand. There are some details that could be of value to, say, the Russians or the Chinese. I don't know that the Houthis have that sophisticated of a system. Maybe the Iranians do, and they could share stuff with them. It's complicated because it's, when he calls them war plans, Hegseth denied that this happened using that phrase. And I think what they're trying to do is litigate the definition of the word war plan. So war plans do refer to, there are things called concept of operations, CONOPS. There are op ords, operations orders. There's a lot more granularity that they could have gone into that they did not. That being said, Yes, I'm just trying to add some nuance to this. That being said,
I'm not trying to push back. Yeah, but I just wanted to read just a couple of excerpts just for clarity. I mean, Pete Hegseth saying, time now, 11:44 Eastern, weather favorable. Just confirmed with CENTCOM, we are go for missile launch. 12:15 Eastern, F-18s launch, first strike package. I mean, this is really granular stuff.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's so proximate to the strike. I think you can say that it's unwise and imprudent to do it. I don't know that I'd say that that's, this is like the Pentagon Papers dumping out, but it's significant. Yeah. And I think the most significant part of all of this is their commentary about it, and the way in which, for example, Vice President Vance talks about his concern around all of this being, the Europeans aren't paying enough, and they have all this shipping going through the Red Sea, for example. It's like, wait, that's why we have this escalation that is very serious. It can have implications. I mean, the president said on Truth Social that this was intended for Iran. It's not just about the Houthis, it's about Iran.
More with Ken after a quick break. I do want to ask you about Jeffrey Goldberg here. Do you think he had a journalistic duty to handle this differently? And I think you're a good person to ask this because you faced these big questions before. You famously released a dossier about JD Vance.
The cache of documents about the Ohio senator that were allegedly obtained in an Iranian hack on former President Trump's campaign. Klippenstein released the 271-page report that the Trump team put together to vet his now running mate, and despite having access to the stolen material, media outlets sat on it, keeping it from the public.
Had it been you, do you think you would have shared more about the messages from the beginning? Do you think you would have stayed on the chat, for example?
Oh, absolutely. He should have stayed in the chat. He should have published based on what is in the public interest rather than what he perceives to be the national security interest. There's this frustrating tendency where the media sort of puts on this hat and deputizes itself as these counterintelligence officers that someone suddenly know what the risks are and how to protect the country. It's like, we don't know any of that stuff. I mean, we could speculate to some extent. The things you're saying, common sense points that, they're talking about something before it happens. That doesn't seem like a good idea. But to play God and say, okay, well, we can't publish this after it's all happened, already taken place. I don't understand the
9 days.
Yeah, I don't understand the rationale for that. And the way in which he discusses it, they fall back on all these acronyms, and it sounds like it's like you're watching The Americans, some spy show or something. Because they're like, this, the operational security, all these things. It's like, guys, we're reporters. All that NatSec stuff, that's their lane. Our lane is it in the public interest? And again, makes sense to ask common sense questions to ensure that you don't hurt anybody. But none of those applied because all of this was after the fact. And I'm not saying this in the academic sense. Like, I've taken risks in terms of, you mentioned the JD Vance dossier, which was hacked by the Iranians. I ended up getting an FBI visit from that. So I know what the consequences are. The consequences are not legal. Yes, you get these annoying FBI visited. Nothing happened. I have not been brought to court. Nothing's going to happen because I didn't break any laws. And when Goldberg, editorializes the story, it says, there's all these operational concerns, and then there's discussion about, maybe the Espionage Act and all these things. There's no legal jeopardy to him. There just isn't. I mean, there are very narrow exceptions to what you can't publish what's called signals intelligence, NSA stuff. He hasn't said that anything like that was there. There's for clandestine agents, you can't publish their identities. He says that one person was in the CIA, but the CIA director testified that this was basically like this wasn't someone in the field. This was someone in Washington who, I think it was his chief of staff. So this is like a Washington bureaucrat he's not skulking around Russia needing to depend on his cover. So again, you have to really litigate some of the specifics of these things. Because I think people just say, spy world, and everybody's brain shuts off and they say, okay, well, we can't talk about any of that. And it's like, that's an unhealthy place for the media to be, in my opinion.
I know. He really didn't want to publish this. And it's like the Trump administration, the way they handled this, they basically forced him to. First of all, they trashed him. And then they said over and over that it's not classified. So it's like, like they did everything they possibly could to ensure that this information came out.
Right. And you have to ask, if they hadn't done that, what would we know? And again, this is not some arcane question. Like when I published the Vance dossier, most of the contents were open source. All of this was verifiable. And so to me, it was an easy call. And to me, this is an easy call because you don't have a source you have to worry about getting in trouble, as is the case in so many stories, as I'm sure you've experienced. You hear something from somebody that's newsworthy, but you can't report it without them getting in trouble. He's in a unique situation where because he was accidentally added to this chat, there's no risk to the source. So to me, this is one of the easiest questions, not just because of that, because of the lack of formal secrecy. I mean, definitionally, if it's taking place outside of those secure systems, you can say that it's already public. But beyond that, it's about their policy in the Middle East in the context of rising tensions with the Iranian regime, in which Trump has repeatedly made these veiled kind of mafia don-like threats where he's like, it would be a real shame if you don't come to the bargaining table. And this gives us some insight into not just the operations, but their opinions and where the different principles stand, what the president thinks about it. I can't think of something more newsworthy than this. And for him to not publish it is just a shame.
Ken, let's talk about Yemen. A U.S. official said following the bombings, this was the beginning of airstrikes on Houthi targets that are expected to continue. President Trump is trying to directly tie this to a broader conflict with Iran, promising to hold the country, quote, fully accountable for the actions of the Houthis. So this is kind of scary stuff. First of many, threatening Iran, certainly has the makings of a protracted conflict with direct U.S. involvement, but that's not where the focus is. What should we be paying attention to, in your opinion?
The fact that this is not same old, same old. When he first carried out those strikes last week, which I reported on at the time, I was amazed to see that the press's response was kind of a meh. And they said, oh, this is what Biden did. It doesn't work. And they just used it to dunk on him and say, oh, more the same, new boss, same as the old. If you read the interviews and comments that the national security officials made right after the strikes, this was not your garden variety, just do a few strikes of their logistical facilities or weapons or something like that. They targeted the leadership elements and the command and control facilities. That is like the brain of the Houthi infrastructure that exists. Mm-hmm. So that is a significant step up the escalatory ladder. I mean, you can imagine if they targeted our leadership, what the response would be versus targeting, ships in the Red Sea. And that was one that the press missed. And that was one that these texts really emphasize. Because they are like backslapping each other about how we took out the guy who's in charge of, it was the Houthi leader of, I think it was the drone program or something like that. And it's like, is there going to be any sort of public debate around that we've decided to go on this route? You know what I mean? At the time that Trump is saying, I'm a peace president and I don't want to get into these stupid wars or something. Again, maybe that's beneficial, maybe it's not, but we should talk about it. And there's been almost no discussion about
almost none
by the press or the White House.
So, Ken, back to the messages exchanged in the chat. After the bombing campaign first started, there were congratulatory messages flying around. There's this fist fire American flag emoji from Waltz. Quote, great work and effects from Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence. She said effects. It's almost like these people are sitting around talking about a video game rather than a bombing campaign, which has killed at least 79 people, including women and children, according to the Houthis. I mean, these texts are so revealing about how these people act and how they think. Were you surprised by anything specifically that you saw in there?
Yeah, I was surprised by splits within the different officials. The vice president basically criticizing President Trump's decision to go ahead with these strikes, not for the human reasons that I think a lot of the public would have, not just the death toll in this strike, but in the toll that might follow from their, retaliation against it, not just against U.S. assets in the region, but even just civilian ships, flowing through the Red Sea. I mean, all of that should be discussed and factored into whether or not we're going to do this. And one of the most striking aspects of the discussion was it certainly wasn't factored in there. You don't see anyone saying, oh gosh, what if this spins out of control into a regional conflict? You just see this discussion of commerce and the Europeans and who should pay. And basically who's going to pick up the tab? Who's going to pick up the check on the restaurant table when we get up from this, Yeah.
So it sounds like the substance rather than the tone was more surprising.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And who knows what else is there? I mean, this is really interesting stuff. You're seeing splits within the administration, what their rationale is, and their real rationale, not the NatSec speak that you get from the Pentagon press secretary when they go, we have defeated. I mean, they are so performative about this. If you go on the CENTCOM, that's the U.S. Combatant Command for the Middle East, Twitter, it's like every few hours, they're like, yep, we hit another target and we're setting back, and it's hashtag Houthis are terrorists.
Yeah.
They've done this like a dozen times. So that's the public message. And meanwhile, in private, they're like, yeah, this is about commerce, but it's not our commerce, so I don't know what we think about this. And it's like much more just money focused and global economic dimensions rather than the I think geopolitical war and human consequences. Because again, we have troops all over the region in these far-flung bases that are sitting ducks for retaliatory strikes by these Iranian-backed groups should they decide to go ahead and do that. So there's like serious risk here. I mean, 3 U.S. service members were killed in January of last year in Jordan, but in one of these far-flung bases because they didn't have the counter-drone technology to be able to stop a probably relatively cheap one-way attack drone that was launched at them by some militia. That can happen at any time. And those are the people that are on the front lines. These are working-class enlistees, not in the officer corps, sent there. I interviewed some of them after the strike, and they were describing they're in the middle of nowhere. They have no support. Washington doesn't know what the heck's going on. And I try to figure out
war has changed so much just in the past 5 years with these drones. I don't know, man. You said it's not the Pentagon Papers. It's starting to feel like the Pentagon Papers for the social media age a little bit.
That's an interesting way to put it. Yeah. When I saw Signal, it was like a sign of the times, right? It's like, wow, everybody's on the same app that we all use now.
I know. When you watch the coverage in the US, there's almost no pushback to the bombing on its face, asking the hard questions about why the Houthis are targeting international shipping, why they are opposing Israel and its allies, including the US. No talk of Israel's war on Gaza. And I think one of the things this incident reveals is that the establishment in Washington is still completely stuck in the war on terror mindset, which I know you covered at places like The Intercept in great detail. It's like they've learned nothing from Iraq, the 20 years in Afghanistan. Ken, is the real scandal here that not that they were using Signal, but that it's 2025 and Washington is stuck in 2003?
I absolutely believe so. I mean, in the chat, they just nonchalantly, one of them says, oh yeah, if the Gaza war ceasefire collapses, then we'll just do this. It's like, wait, what? You think that that's like a very distinct possibility, and you guys aren't concerned about that, as not just as it relates to the human question, but even as it's going to relate to the Houthis? You think the Houthis are going to be fine with that? They've cited very explicitly that the Gaza war is one of their motives for targeting these things transiting through the Red Sea. So if that collapses, you can imagine that they're going to do something about it, and that's going to affect exactly the thing you're looking at. And he just mentions it as some offhand thing. So it's clear that this stuff is a very remote concern to them, even though there's, universities here in the United States with protesters. And I mean, it's clearly an issue that's much more urgent in the minds of, I think, ordinary Americans than it is in certainly the White House and probably Washington more generally.
Ken Klippenstein, thank you for coming on The Take.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's The Take. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about today's episode. Have you been following the fallout from the Trump administration's Signal group chat leak? Let's keep the conversation going, and we'll see you tomorrow.